All right, cool. I think we've got enough people to start up the session for today. I'm really excited to talk with you, Elizabeth. I want to thank you for being here. I'll just give everyone a little bit of background, a quick overview of what you were doing. You were at the company that we mentioned before, and you were leading the data science effort, the data science teams there. It was a startup. And then, like we said, it went under, and you've since transitioned out of a startup and you went to the corporate beast that is Deloitte. So we get to see both sides. And what I'm really excited to talk to you about today is this whole idea of tooling and the definition of roles that I think comes up quite a bit in the community. First of all, how to choose the right tool for the right problem. And then the other thing that is really important right now is, what do we call each other? Or is there such thing as an MLOps engineer? Or what is a data scientist supposed to do and what are they not supposed to do? But before we get into any of that, I think it would be perfect if you could tell us a little bit about where you're coming from, how you ended up in this community and chatting with me right now.
So, if anyone didn't hear, we met prior to this when Pierce was trying to sell us some MLOps tooling, which was great and we needed it. At a startup, it can be challenging to explain to people as you're building out artificial intelligence why additional roles, software, checks, balances, testing, monitoring, and maintenance need to be applied, because a lot of times it's let's build it fast, quickly, and we'll see if it adds value. The problem is it can also break very quickly. And that's fine if it's not in production. If it's in production and you have more than 100 users, it's not always great. So my company did go under, and we were focused on building out bookkeeping AI. Which is an interesting problem in itself. But we were focused on building out bookkeeping AI for small and medium-sized businesses who have very different organizational structures, and so they usually organize their finances very differently across the board. Which led us to recognizing that we really needed MLOps probably earlier on than we thought, because a lot of the machine learning tooling that we were using, or a lot of the artificial intelligence that we were building, required many different builds, because no small business is the same. So a lot of our algorithms started to jet out into a segmented fashion where we had to say, okay, it's not even apples to oranges. It's, you got a pineapple over there, there's a watermelon over here, we have a banana, that's a steak. So we're not going to even touch that right now. And, we think that some of these things are molding, but we're not sure. So we need to go in and check that, which made for a very interesting pipeline. But the larger question that came up at that time then was, okay, well, the data science team will do it. And I was like, we have a lot of statisticians. We have a lot of people that are really good with machine learning algorithms. We have people that, if they really wanted to, they could build out the pipeline, but they don't have experience in maintaining it. They don't have the wherewithal or the software engineering background to actually be able to say this is how it fits into the application well, which was problematic. And we knew that from the get-go, but everyone kept thinking that the solve would be to hire more data scientists. So for me, it was going back to leadership and the head of engineering and saying, no, please stop. You can add on or put as many as you want. You're not going to solve the major issue that we have. And then I will go into that in more detail. But after my company went under, I actually consulted for quite a bit with a lot of other startups who were trying to do something very similar. And the business models for them differed greatly, but the way that you needed to set up data science, ML, MLOps, data engineering did not. And this title conundrum came up with every single one of them, because it was continuously, well, we can just hire a data scientist because, yeah, we need ETL pipelines and we need somebody to make sure that they architect a very good relational database and then, push all of that reporting out to our multiple users. And I was like, time out. Well, I think probably there is a data scientist that can do that. Is that the right person that you should be hiring? And they're like, it has data in the title. Ooh, famous last words, also very scary. So that was really interesting because that's actually what prompted me talking about this was just kind of going over specific use cases and how it is a pretty general problem when businesses are small. I don't know if anyone on the call is working for a larger business or a medium on that, because this is really more formatted around trying to build up that initial group or trying to lead a digital transformation. And I'm doing this because digital transformation, depending on your age, usually means pretty different things. That's where I'm coming from. And it's really just trying to go around lessons learned for me, because I don't want you to have the same headache that I did. And then now I work at Deloitte, and it's another consulting gig. It's in the government sector, but I'm on day 3, so I can't really tell you anything other than they have a great onboarding program with the current conundrum of working from home.
Awesome. Well, I love all of that. And I love hearing about you realizing that, hey, this isn't something that is specific to this one company that I was working at. You got to see it many times over. So what are some patterns besides the fact that the management wasn't able to correctly define the right person for the right job? What other patterns were you seeing when there were these small startups or medium-sized startups that were going into machine learning and building out their team, but they just couldn't get it working?
I'll give you 2 examples. So one company that I consulted with was not a startup. They had been around for 70 years, and they were trying to pivot, like a lot of people are doing right now with COVID. And so they were thinking about switching over from a BI platform into more of an integrated automation where you could get reporting and insights to not only your external customers, but also your internal customers. And they were heavily focused on that. Problem with that was data collection. They didn't have the data that they wanted to deliver insights on. So they were trying to pivot into an insight format, but they hadn't kept timestamps for certain things. They hadn't been collecting certain attribute data that would be highly valuable if they were trying to make decisions. I'm gonna leave that one out. They were collecting unique identifiers that once they tried to create their data product were no longer unique. So it was just the basic collection format for a lot of the build that they hadn't really thought through, and they were already moving on to predictive analytics. So it was bringing them back and saying, okay, let's start from point A and then move on to predictive analytics in a fashion where you can start to garner insights, create decision trees that are very simple, even run a very basic linear regression with the mentality of it's probably going to be a pretty bad prediction, but at least you have it in your pipeline. Then I was working with a startup right before this. Same thing. They wanted to create a data product that they said that they had been collecting the right data for. They were fine. They just needed the algorithm to go into production. What was the problem? No, they hadn't been collecting the data that they needed for the algorithm. And for a lot of the collection processes that they had set up, they weren't correcting the right data or the right way. So universally, we're just bad at knowing what we need to collect before we actually want to build the thing. So the first point that I would always come up with and talk to people about, and this happened in my prior company too, was what do you want to do? Do you have the data? Anyone that you usually talk to in management from a high level, and from a high level, they usually are not wrong. Yes, they do. From a very granular level, no, they do not. Because with a lot of machine learning, it's supervised. So it's historical information, which means that you need a certain amount of information before it actually works. And for that, it's not as simple as saying, yeah, we have enough of it. It's, did you collect it properly? Is there high quality? Is there good integrity? Is it reliable? Can you make sure that when you look at this data point 2 years ago, it was collected the same way? What's the lineage? Probably not awesome. Because you were a startup, you changed all of your processes and practices within that period of time, probably very quickly. If you didn't, you weren't taking on an agile methodology. So that, with the startup arena, pretty much in my experience now has been consistently the same of you're just always going to have issues with data collection. What I was surprised was any company that I actually worked with that was small or medium, that was not a startup, had the exact same issues because that legacy system that they were trying to connect to or the new product that they wanted to build was just a little too what prior to this to translate up easily.
Sorry, I just missed that last part. Can you say that again? You had me on the edge of my seat.
Oh, I'm like, which part? I've been running my mouth pretty fast.
No, you were talking. Well, first of all, let me just recap that and say something that I really enjoyed on that idea of how you take this agile methodology and yes, you need to be changing continuously and optimizing, right? But if you're not creating lineage for your data, or if you are not keeping all of this data in check, then it's just going to be a nightmare when you want to go today and build products. And then you need this historic data, but it's been changed 5 times by that point. And so it's just like, how are we going to make a product that is doing any kind of prediction or anything when you don't have the data? So yeah, that is brilliant. And then I don't know what you said because I kind of lost you.
After that, it was really just a lot of it gets lost in translation as you're transitioning. So for any company of any size, when they're trying to create that new data product, the majority of the time, they really haven't collected the data they need because it's either changed too much, they don't have enough of it, or the process for setting up that collection period wasn't done by somebody that was, and this is going to be very simple and people may disagree, organized. And if you're not organized in data collection, you don't usually have a good end. So for me, across the board, that was the interesting thing, because should that be a data scientist? And this is what we're going to keep going back to throughout the call, is from a role specification, that person's coming in, but collection, governance, integrity, reliability is usually something that needs to happen at a leadership level because it needs to be an initiative throughout the whole company.
Mm.
So who should be owning that? Should it be the solo data scientist that they just brought on that's supposed to create this fun new algorithm, and maybe they're highly invested in deep learning and they want nothing to do with the collection format, they just want it to be there? Or should it be somebody that's going to stay with the company probably a long time, because that's a whole different pipeline of work that needs to be done consistently? And in a startup, I don't know the right answer, because you could have one person, you could have 2 people, you could have 50 people. But how do you divide and conquer data collection when your core product is going to be a data product and still allow your data scientists to create algorithms and work on predictive tools? And for us, our solve for that was really starting to push the idea that data science should function more as an R&D unit within the company, even if it's small, and always be a little bit ahead of the product build so that they can test that it actually works out. Some people may disagree with that because at a certain stage in a startup, you just need something. So that first MVP, when you're trying to get investors to come in and say, yeah, let me throw a few million on this, do you say data science should be at least 3 to 6 months in advance when the company's only been around for 2 months? Probably not. That's a bad scenario. So there are some caveats. But when it really gets down to trying to figure out how you should be building out your data science team, they do need to be in the testing mentality of, does this algorithm work? Does this one algorithm also solve the unique case of always producing an output within the application? I have never seen that happen. Usually you have some hard-coded rules in the beginning and the end for when there's errors, it fails, or when the algorithm just isn't reliable enough to answer that question. But in that scenario, who should be writing the code? Who should be in charge of the application? Who should be in charge of those input, output, and ingestion points? From a high level, the way that I always explained it to leaders was, okay, you have one brilliant person at the company that you rely on for everything. They walk outside, the air is sunny, birds are chirping, and they get hit by a bus. Now what do? They I mean, didn't love that example because it was a little dramatic, but it definitely stuck in their heads in a way where you continuously are thinking, okay, yeah, we're a company. So if we make this centered around one person with the idea that, yes, they can do it all, is that a good mentality? When do you bring in other people? He was always trying to create a broad enough scope to recognize that if that person wasn't hired yet, we should at least have them in the pipeline. And if you want your data scientists to do everything because they are a full stack data scientist, you're going to run into problems because as soon as they start to create other algorithms that they need to monitor and maintain, you quickly lose them as a resource that can start to create new things.
Mm, that's a great
And
point right there.
they're usually not that great at it. I know that I am not that great at creating algorithms and maintaining them and monitoring them all at the same time.
Mm.
And there's probably beautiful unicorns out
So
there
do you
that
look
are.
at that as something like, okay, then could we use tooling to better our performance? And if we don't want to bring on more people, we use tooling to augment our abilities? Or is
Yeah.
it something that you need someone that just knows how to do the monitoring piece?
So every startup that I consulted with, I told them two things. You're eventually going to need to bring on somebody from MLOps. And if you find somebody that can quasi act as a data engineer MLOps person, perfect. You need to probably start to divide that out. It's great if you find that person. They're going to be very expensive because if they're good at what they do, everyone wants one right now. Coupled with you can totally bring on the tools, but then you need at least 3 people in your organization to understand how the tooling works. And if you don't know what you're doing, bring on the MLOps person, have them buy the tooling for you so you at least make a good investment, and then have them do additional things within the data realm.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. And now I'm seeing a question in the chat from Sumita asking
Oh,
if you've ever seen the reverse happen, where there's been an MLOps person that's been hired prematurely and there's been barely any ML solutions, but the person is trying to build out an entire pipeline without having an idea of what solutions will come up.
I have. And for this, it really goes back to this idea of when you're in a startup, you're supposed to be building things that will have a return on investment to some degree or increase efficiency. So I had somebody that I consulted with that had hired out a whole team. They had 10 people. Their company was 20 people large. So half the company was devoted to it. The main problem that they had is that their solution that was algorithmic and ML oriented was not in production in a way where you could say that testably it was providing value and outputting the right thing to the end user. So that was problematic because they didn't review their output well enough and they didn't do enough user testing to signify that the MLOps person that they had hired on was going to be valuable because in reality, the whole data product that they had just built may not have been valuable. So they had a situation where they were running out of money and that meant their burn chart was increasing steadily down. The advice and solution that we came up with was actually cutting half the team. And that meant actually getting rid of the MLOps person and going back to the drawing board on what they could create as a product that would be valuable. Now, I don't think that's a scenario where you probably hired the MLOps person per se too early. I think it's a scenario where you hired out the whole team too early because you didn't have something that would provide value and probably a little bit mismanagement of funds. It does happen, but I don't think building out the entire pipeline, even in scenarios where maybe the algorithm you're using doesn't quite work fantastically, is a problem. Because I have another person that I consulted with that they built out the pipeline, hired an MLOps person and data engineer. So that was a scenario where it was a data engineer, MLOps person, And that person could maintain their database and also create reporting for them internally and their investors. Because if anyone's been in a startup, they also know that you continuously need to provide your investors with an update on what's going on. And that needs to be done in a nice report, usually with some designer that's hired as a contractor to make you make sure that you understand where you're at, because it's going to dictate how that meeting goes. So in that realm, you had somebody that was what I would call like probably one of the best hires you've ever had, because they were able to create a machine learning pipeline, maintain it, and monitor it so they could give reporting feedback to the investors, to leadership, and to the company at large and product. Coupled with, while the algorithm didn't perform as well as they were hoping that it would, they at least had the pipeline set up so that they could just run more algorithms and test it. Because the end solution that they were trying to solve for, that was still viable and necessary. The user response to actually receiving the output that was semi-automated was fantastic. So in that scenario, you created your minimal viable product, you tested it, you know that it provides value, you just need to tweak it and iterate to a point where it actually can provide the value that the customer wants, instead of, I think one of the replies that one of the customers said was, WTF, is this a robot? Because I don't understand why this would be an output. And I was like, okay.
Yeah, that's never good.
Probably need a few like error checks before we output some of these things. So it really depends on what type of product you're trying to build and if you're sticking to a product lifecycle. And Sumita, does that answer your question?
Yeah, let us know, Sumita, in the chat if that gets at the question. I had another question along the lines of the idea of, cool, Sumita says yes, the idea of hiring someone that is an MLOps practitioner. Have you seen companies go about hiring someone that is more in DevOps and then just trying to ramp them up?
I have not fully. And I will say that with startups, a lot of times DevOps comes a little bit later to a degree, and they just put them over that software engineering umbrella. So I've seen a lot of people that know how to do at DevOps, but they also know how to do back-end and front-end build. I don't think it's a bad thing to do. Again, it goes with the stage of the company, right? If you're creating your first MVP, you got your seed round, you've sold the idea, but you have nothing that you can actually test or show. It does become a question of, should you be hiring out somebody at that point to do DevOps? Nothing's really going to be in production. The results that you get will all go to your friends and family, and there's a lot of dummy data or personal data that you've connected to it. So this is a scenario. I mean, not everyone does it that way, but a lot of people do. Then after that, when you start to go into a realm where you're actually going to be using customer data, you're going to probably have some security issues that you wanted to keep up. I think it really does go into the question of, I've seen people hire out like a security engineer that also does DevOps, again, unicorn. And for that stage, like that's that period where you should probably hire out both, in my opinion, because if you don't set it up early, then you don't know. And if you don't have good monitoring and tracking, then when you go to the investors and you say, we're doing super well, and they're like, how do you know? And you're like, well, we don't really have any monitoring or tracking. So
Yeah.
This is from our application database with the 3 metrics that we collect that, we hard coded in, and it just tells us that somebody logged in. Cool. That's great. Logins are awesome. Do we know if it's an actual user? No. Problematic. But in my experience, it's after that seed round where you have the most basic MVP, then those have to follow, because they start to recognize that, again, they can't have the 2 software engineers that they hired in the beginning do everything. I have seen some software engineers that were the initial 2 hires become DevOps and then build that out for monitoring and security. And that's been awesome. I think that would be a very unique blend to try to really push, where you just have a degree that's centered around that. But once the company grows a little bit more, you again need to split it apart and have somebody do just security, just DevOps. So I think it's this branching technique that I keep seeing, where you try to hire somebody that's a very big generalist with the mentality that, jack of all trades. Oh, you want that? We can do this. Sure. Like I can, try that. But when the company starts to grow to a size where you actually have real clients that are expecting a certain level of service, and you usually need to start to say that role needs to be one person, because we need to make sure that their time and effort is devoted to that.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes total sense. You want to make sure that you can hack something together, you see value in it, and then all right, we can hire someone new to do this because we see that there's actually an ROI here.
Yeah.
So the next question I wanted to ask, I mean, I want to get into so much, but just to go over what you've been saying, I think it's fascinating how the main problem you were talking about is this data collection and talking with the higher ups to make sure that the data collection is being done, first of all, I guess.
Yeah, that's
And,
number
and
one.
then
You'd be surprised.
being done is number one, and then being done well is the next thing. And this disconnect that you talk about between like the higher ups thinking that it's being done and then someone that's actually on the ground floor who tells you what they've been doing and you go, well, this isn't going to work. How can that bridge be gap, or how can that gap be bridged?
And for that, I will say education, because for me, the step back that I always have to take is I'm like, yada, 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 data terms, data terms, data terms, like, and everyone else is going, sure. Yeah, I totally know what you're talking about. And I'm not looking at the fear in their eyes where they're like trying to run away. So it's recognizing that a lot of people don't want to delve into engineering, data science, even analytics. Numbers, code, it scares them, especially because if they're at a high level or even sometimes a lower like level SME, their lack of knowledge is to them seen as a detriment. So for me, it's always going in and saying, look, you may not understand what this person does and they may not understand what you do. That's okay. You both went on separate education routes and now you're in the positions that you are because, this was the path that hopefully you wanted to choose. Setting that baseline is usually a good idea because sometimes in organizations, people can be a little bit snooty or, assholes. It happens. And usually when they're bringing in an outside consultant at that point, it's not because everything's going smoothly. So a lot of it's just like, okay, we're all friends. Let's hold hands, kumbaya. And you can make fun of me, but don't make fun of each other. Then saying, okay, here are some just basic terms that I'm going to use. I'm going to define them, even if this feels like it's a first grade classroom and you're all really bored. At least we're just setting the baseline. After that, it's then saying, what do we have in our database? Do you have a data dictionary? Do you have a business glossary? Do you have active reporting where you actually review the data points on a weekly or monthly basis? Typically in startups, the answer is no. Small businesses, medium-sized businesses that are trying to pivot, the answer is yes, but it's the other problem where they have all the information, but they're not reviewing it anymore because they've had it for so long that it's just like, yeah, we have that quarterly review where I get the same report. And as long as this is in the green and not in the red, I know that I'm good. Great, because that's an awesome use of visualization. All they needed to do was distill down that they're in the green and they're very happy. Bad because they're not actually looking at the information that's being populated for them. So they have no idea what's available. And leadership will say there was an initiative, 7 months ago or 7 years ago where we started collecting this. That's fine. People on the ground will say, yeah, we stopped collecting it because there was an issue with the build and we had a bug, but it wasn't high priority, so we never fixed it. So this has just been outputting zeros for the past 5 years. Ooh, okay, yeah. So you don't have it. Are they probably going to tell leadership that? No. So from a startup arena, it's actually beautiful because it's new. You weren't supposed to be collecting it for 7 years. It doesn't matter. let's, start from a baseline. We'll build it out quickly. We'll figure out from a prioritized standpoint what we actually need to grab, and then we'll move forward. From the small or medium-sized business that's a little bit older, that communication breakdown is not going to be seen as a good thing, because if things like that keep coming up, then it leads to a larger organizational problem where you're probably not handling that. It's saying it all at once. So you haven't been collecting data point A, B, C, or D.
Can you say that again real fast? I just lost you again.
I would say my way of solving that is just saying it all at once. Gather all the things you haven't been doing, so you just rip off the Band-Aid really fast and really hard, and you're whammied with the reality of what's going on. The trickle effect is where I've seen a lot of things go poorly. Oh, we weren't collecting that for this reason. Oh, we weren't collecting that anymore for this reason. Because slowly leadership starts to recognize we have been communicating poorly, but also I was peeved the first time, I'm pissed the second time, and now I'm infuriated the third. And the clean break of just saying we haven't been collecting all of these things because they just haven't been a priority, and we didn't know that this information is going to be useful until now, is logical. For a lot of things, why would you start to spend a lot of engineering resources or other resources on collection for something that you have no idea if it was actually going to be valuable in the future? It's a conundrum, because for data science, we're like, please collect it all down to the millisecond. But it doesn't actually provide value in that period of time. It could be a suck. So in that scenario, it's usually, here's a report. Here's how you should probably start to change this. And it is a good discussion to then bring up of, do you have enough DevOps people? Do you have enough monitoring people? Is your engineering team large enough to actually start producing a data product? Or do you need to bring on more people for this team?
Yeah, and I also think about the idea of just the cost that's involved in that, and how you make this great point of, well, we don't know if down the road we're actually going to do anything with this data. So, and we saw it was costing us this much per month. So we just said, we'll forget about it for now. And later, if we ever need it, then we'll start collecting it again.
And I mean, for large enterprise organizations, I think that storage issue becomes a larger problem because it is really costly. For small organizations, it's kind of like, it's 5 cents a month, dude. You can keep collecting it. So there's, a cost benefit scenario that you continuously need to go in. But when I worked in a hospital system, if we collected another data point, the issue was PII. How much security do we need to have around it? Okay, we have thousands upon thousands of users that will be accessing this data and entering in this data. Adding one more data point is in the millions very easily. In a startup, how many users do you usually have in your first year? If you get 1,000 that are active users, I am so impressed. You're going to be going into that billion sphere really quickly. If you get 100, that's probably more normal. So then it kind of goes into, okay, yes, there's a cost benefit, but there's also the engineering costs in that beginning period. And that's really where you're going to get hammered. You have 3 engineers, or you have 3 people that are on the engineering team. You have 1 QA person. Cool. Are we going to use any of that time to fix this data point that we don't know is valuable? Probably not. Because if you do take an agile methodology to it, it's highest priority, finish it the fastest you can, and move on to the next highest priority. Try to make sure it's low-hanging fruit. If it's complicated, break it down. For data points, especially if you're not using them, it's usually, okay, it's going to the back of the backlog. Maybe it disappears. Maybe it's at the backlog point where they listed at the lowest priorities that they can have a self-timer now where it just deletes itself after a certain period. And then it's gone.
The self-destruct.
Yep. But that's where it starts to become a fun and terrible game of, again, sitting everyone down like they're in a first grade classroom and explaining that data collection is actually how you create a data product, whether you like it or not. Yes, you can buy enrichment sources, but I don't know if anyone on the chat has purchased enrichment sources before. Usually it's not that solution that you were hoping for. Usually it doesn't translate over enough to the data sources that you want that you can really say that it's reliable. And on top of that, if you're using it, a lot of other people have a niche product, it's hard. Yeah.
So I've got a
Enrichment
question
sources.
in the chat that's coming through from Rick, and he's asking if there are heuristic ways sorry, I think he's asking, is there a way to know what data is going to be valuable down the road and in which format?
So I do put everyone through an exercise, and I say, okay, here's your product roadmap. You want to be here in a year. That's blue sky. The issue with creating a data product is that you want to be here. You need to collect data before the year end to make sure that you can get there. So let's start with your product roadmap and go over all of the data points that you would actually need to collect. It's interesting because you usually start to lose people. And you need to break it out into like 3 or 5 sessions. But I continuously go over what are the 10 top data points that you would need to answer the question for saying that you actually created this thing. And what are the top 10 data points that you would need to ingest to create something that could output that. And then we just keep going through that consistently. It's not a solution that per se is going to work easily, because if you're working in an agile format and it's very young, you're probably going to completely change the idea for your company within that year. It happens all the time. Or you're going to go on a slightly different bent, or one of the integrations you have isn't going to work, or it's not going to populate those fields. But it's a beautiful demonstration of what you actually need to start thinking about. And it gets everyone on the same page, because you'll get somebody that's a product owner that will say, well, I need to know that I can get this metric, and this metric, and our user needs this output. Cool. Then you'll have an engineer say, when does your user need that output? And you said the average, but what time number are we using? And then they start to talk. And that's great, because it starts to create the conversation that they're going to have on a weekly basis.
So is this something that you feel like you need a data scientist to be able to have these conversations?
I do not think you need a data scientist to be able to have those conversations. And that's usually the point that I try to make, is if you have somebody that has 2 PhDs in, I'm trying to think, one in statistics, the other in economics, and that may have not been the best move, but who knows? And you're bringing them on because they're a subject matter expert. They also have a beautiful understanding of mathematics, and they can program to their little heart's content and test everything to make sure that the algorithm that you want to put in works. That's fantastic. But that's what you hired them for. And so that's where it kind of goes back to this title definition of, if that's what you hired the data science for and that's their role, when you start to put them in this governance mentality, and I will say almost, babysitter mentality, they may not be happy. And for good reason. You told them that you were hiring them based on their expertise of what they're very good at. And then they're not doing anything in that realm, because a lot of the grunt work is being established in a way where it's them having to really understand how the organization works, how the people in the organization work, and then have to stage very odd conferences where you basically have the whole company try to come together and, pass the ball around, but in a way where nobody touches it twice. It's an odd technique that you need to apply when you're trying to do data collection, because it's organizational. But once it's in a database or in some format, it can then be used by the data scientist. It's still data, but I don't think a data scientist should be doing that, because they don't always have the experience to make sure that those initiatives are fruitful. And a lot of times people don't like the person that's telling you to do data collection. So it's already a negative like nix on their docket, and they haven't even created something at that point. So then there's a question of, how are you valuable? How are you helping us? And everyone just thinks you made us do data collection and it was miserable and I hated it. And you haven't produced any algorithms. You don't want to put somebody in that situation. So yeah, I would say
That's so funny. The idea of that, I mean, I've heard it time and time again of companies that are just like, yeah, our executives really, they want to know what our data scientists do, because all they're doing right now is just costing the company a lot of money.
And I've heard that time and time again. One of the people that I came on for, they were like, we can't afford to keep her anymore. And I'm like, okay, like she's been here 3 months and she's already produced, and this is with the data scientists that they had, 3 different algorithms that prove that you can actually create a viable product. I'm like, I don't get it. And they're like, well, she produced them, so now that's it. And I'm like, oh no, we got a long road ahead of us. This is not how that works. And they're like, well, we can just plug it in. I'm like, she did it in a Jupyter notebook. Have you guys looked at the Jupyter notebook? Like, she did a quick and dirty. This in no way is going to go into production anytime soon unless you have a brilliant ML engineer that doesn't mind doing extreme busy work. And they were like, okay. And then we had to go into this concept of data engineer, MLOps, how they wanted to define it within their organization. Because what it really got down to is they had no clue what it was going to take to actually put their data product into production and make it produce real value. But their investors wanted something that had machine learning in it, which is something else I like to hark on. Is I don't understand why everyone wants a machine learning algorithm from an investment standpoint when they don't know what machine learning really is. And that's where I'm kind of like, guys, you really just want an output that's going to be automated. And you could use hard-coded rules for this. It doesn't have to have machine learning. And I think that's something that time and time again, for that initial MVP also, I'm like, I don't know if you actually need a data scientist for your initial MVP. You really just want to make sure that you can produce an output that a user can ingest and then determine that they provide valuable. And that's where you start to see models where they have a human come in and, just fill it out. Or they have a hard-coded rule where it's like, yes, no. And it's very simple. But if the user comes back and says, I would like to know if something could do this for me and I wouldn't have to do it myself, this provides real value to me. Great. Then bring on a data scientist.
Yeah, and that's something that we've been talking about quite a bit in the Slack is when is it necessary to have it be machine learning, and when is it good enough with just a regular hard-coded algorithm, as you say? And that is a problem that I think a lot of people they're very quick to jump at trying to do machine learning, but 9 times out of 10, or maybe 8 times out of 10, it's not needed. And so you have to have a really, really deep understanding of the value that it will bring if it is used or done by machine learning.
I agree. And it's actually been something that's been interesting because I've been talking to a lot of product leaders, and my push is that they need to understand that a little bit better. Because you usually have a lot of people in product that are trying to do the design. And once it goes a little bit, I will say, into the sphere of machine learning or anything that could be an algorithm, they hire a data scientist because it's what they've seen everyone else do.
Yeah.
The problem is, I think you guys have probably also talked about the division between decision science and data science and how it's a little bit different. A lot of them, if we're going to say that decision science is, the product business analyst of anything data, they usually need a decision scientist in the beginning to say, look, you want to create something that's super fun and cool, and you decided to apply deep learning to it. That's awesome. But you could really just use a logistic regression. And I don't even know if we want to call that machine learning at this point. Or you could, if you really wanted to, say, if blue, output blue. If not blue, output not blue. Ta-da! And that's terrifying because you could have hired somebody that probably was given the idea that they were going to build this super cool new tool that nobody else had built before, and we were going to disrupt and change the industry, and it was going to be mega awesome. And then they get there and they're like, oh no, they don't need me. But do I tell them that after I left my prior job and just got my 3 months of benefits added on? I don't know. I'm going to be a terrible person right now and say I probably wouldn't. I would look for other solutions that the data scientists could actually implement. And then, hey, you don't really need me for this, but here's 5 other things that I could do that could provide real value. And I don't know if anybody else on the chat has any other opinions on this.
Yeah, I'm sure we are quite opinionated on all of this. If anybody wants to drop us something in the chat, feel free to. I think I saw somebody had their hand up. And so, yeah, Laszlo, I see you with your hand up. Before we jump, I'll let you take the next question, Laszlo, but I see another question coming through from Sumita again, and asking about the sexy ML product. When does it make sense for a team to start using special tools and platforms like SageMaker or any of these other MLOps tools? And when do you make the transition between simple internal tooling to the outside tools?
Okay, I'm going to ask what you mean by the outside tools. And
I think that's like third-party tools. Like when does it make sense to bring something on? And correct me if I'm wrong on this, Sumita.
For me, it really depends on the use case. Because I've used SageMaker before and it benefited the MVP, but it did not benefit us long term, and we were trying to iterate and build on top of it. The other thing is if you have a team that maybe isn't highly skilled in one area. So let's say that you have a team of people that if you wanted to create your own monitoring platform could not, then you would purchase it or you would hire somebody out. And again, I think you can go into the cost benefit analysis of that, but a lot of it, if you're trying to do it quickly, is usually if you don't have the person, and this is my rule of thumb, if you don't have the person and a tool will solve the issue and you know that you can get a service rep and a service engineer to help you with it, then it's completely okay. Because at least the tool in a lot of scenarios is usually cheaper than hiring out that individual person. Caveat for that, if the risk of that tool being your solution is too high, then you hire out a person. Because for something like security, you don't want to say, yeah, we just hired the security tool and we think it's great and all of our 20,000 users are on it and they're helping us and it's great. And then you recognize that there's so many holes in your system that anyone could pull out all of their PII and their credit card information. Not good. That's something that you would probably never want to do. I'm not going to say I've seen that be done before, but
But you have.
But there's scenarios where people build so quickly and so fast and they hit a motion of like, we're just going to keep going. That moment of, sitting down, taking in, experiencing the present, and then recognizing that your present is probably going to have a lot of issues where hackers are just going to be like, well, this is fun. That's where I would say maybe consider that a risk scenario and hire out a person. But for every algorithm that I've started, every data product that I've made, it really just depends on the scenario. If there's a tool out there that I think is easy enough so that we don't have to hire on someone right away, I'll use it as long as the risk is low enough. But every single time that I've had any type of, I will say machine learning tool, not MLOps tool, there's usually a point where it just doesn't do enough for me and I can't tweak it the way that I want to, that I either need to create another algorithm that sits with it, which ensemble technique, or I say, you know what, this isn't going to provide value long-term because we can't keep iteratively building on it. And if we have any application changes too along this, we are not going to easily be able to control this or take this into consideration. But that then goes back to, in that scenario, that's the conversation where you say, we need an MLOps person. While we may be getting rid of the MLOps tool, we need somebody with MLOps because I should not be making these decisions right now of it's not going to easily fit into the rest of our application. And oh, look, here's our security system that, it doesn't actually talk to. That's problematic. And that's where, one, you need to probably start having a larger conversation with the whole team. But two, I think the thing that I would always say, and the word of caution that I've told everyone, is if you start to say, I think we probably need an MLOps person because we're at a point where I don't know how to answer these questions, you should have put in the job rec or put out the job rec like 2 months before. So always have it ready and start to think, if we're moving beyond just something that, we're testing together and no customers are using it, to customers are using it and we no longer can keep track of who's testing what, hire an MLOps person. Like, please do it.
Yeah, such great points. So I'm going to let Laszlo, I know you had a question. If you want to just unmute yourself and have a go at it, feel free.
Hi, do you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Elizabeth, thanks for your time. I actually have an opinion on what you said about whether you need a data scientist, even if you need a rule-based solution or a logistic regression. I think one of the tests when we use if something is a machine learning problem or not is that can you define your problem without data, or is it a data-defined product? And I think if it's a data-defined product, even if you have a simple solution, that's a data science problem. You need data scientists to know that that simple solution do solve the problem and fits the data properly, and how to iterate over on top of that. So that was my only comment. So I do think that even if it's a rule-based solution, you need data scientists for that.
So I would ask you, Laszlo, in a scenario, and I agree with that if you're in any company size larger than an initial startup stage, but if you have very limited funds and you have 3 engineers that can actually implement the, let's say, very simple rule-based solution, would you bring a data scientist on in that scenario?
Yeah, obviously, restricted resources are always a problem. So can I change one engineer to a data scientist? That I would raise this as a question, but clearly then you have less features. I mean, it depends on how core potential problems down the line about these algorithms are, because how do you know in advance that the rule-based solution will going to be like MVP level? But yes, that's a business problem from that point onward. It's not a technical problem, I think.
No, and I do agree with you that even very simple solutions, even if it's an if-else statement, you still probably need a data scientist whenever you have an established product. Yeah. Because the testing that's going to be involved is going to be heavy. And the ability to say this is the best solution that can be solved the quickest, it's easier, it's simplest, and we can build on top of it later on, it should be the data scientist saying that, because they will be the person that builds on top of it or determines that it's good enough. But the main issue that I keep coming up with from consulting with startups is if it's your first product and you know that it's an if-else solution and you can put it in place and you don't know anything after that, is hiring at a data scientist at that point a good idea? Because after that, the person may be pushed to create something, or in other scenarios, be considered the person that's not doing much work because the company and the product team hasn't found another product that they need a data scientist on. And that's where I always have a cautionary tale, because in my opinion, a data scientist should be able to run and free throughout the data. But in those scenarios, they usually don't have a lot of data because the only thing that they built was an if-else algorithm that outputs the data that now they're collecting, but they only have 20 rows. And if you only have 20 rows of data, and Laszlo, I would love your opinion on this, would you want to join that company?
Yes, I completely agree with you that you need to define your question whether your machine learning is a core part of your business or not. My previous company was, and it means that we were having machine learning engineers from day one. But if that's not the case, then I completely agree with you. Maybe you can get away with a business intelligence person, like a data scientist in the classical sense, who analyzes KPIs and runs A/B tests, because that's an important task as well. I mean, productionized machine learning is not the only thing what a data scientist can do. But I agree with you. That's early phase is a different question than probably pre-Series A or something.
Yeah, and for me, the thing that I keep going back to is I've worked with a lot of people now that I've told them the same thing that you just said. You can still hire on a data scientist that's going to be a KPI wizard, and they will set up your metrics, and they can probably help you with that data collection portion because their background is usually more business intelligence or information management. The problem is if you sold them on the fact that they were going to be pushing machine learning algorithms into production, it was going to be highly complex, and they were going to be doing a ton of cool things in AWS and spinning up clusters, that's not going to happen. They're probably going to be using Power BI or some like Chartio Tableau format and working with a lot of people that they continuously need to discuss. This is why we pick this metric, and this is what it means. It's a very different job description, in my opinion. And I've seen a few people that I've consulted with where they're like, they left. And I'm like, well, can you blame them? Like,
I completely agree, and that's one of the largest problem what we are facing with is I'm actually running a consultancy now and dealing with startups that we are providing a service for a short period of time that you can have these solutions, and then you probably engineering can maintain the rest of the time, because clearly startups don't need fully fledged machine learning engineer teams on a continuous basis unless they have 50 or 100 employees. But if a product crucially require a machine learning solutions for a couple of months, then what do you do? So you can't move forward or backward.
And I think that's great, because a lot of what I go into now is just saying, look, if you don't know if you're going to have that data scientist on full time because you don't have a product roadmap that needs and requires machine learning products all the time, hire them out as a contractor or as a consultant, because it's a kinder and nicer way to let the data scientist fit into the environment. And then there's not that weird discussion of how are you providing value after you created your first algorithm, which I've talked with a lot of data scientists who've been in the same boat. It's not a fun feeling. You want to be the person that everyone's like, oh yeah, hey, we like her, it's great, hi. Not the person where it's like, shame.
This is fascinating. And Elizabeth, thank you so much. Laszlo, thanks for asking these questions. This is one of the questions of our existence right now in the MLOps world. How do these things work together? How can we make sure that the data scientists are providing value? And when do we need a data scientist? What exactly is the role that the data scientist should be expected to do? And when do you need the machine learning engineer? And these clearly defined titles and work tasks, or who owns what, I think is really a tough question to go into, because of like all these caveats that you're talking about right now with Laszlo. All of this different stuff is okay. If you're at a startup, it's one thing. And if you're at a larger company, it's another thing. But if your data product is number one, then it's another thing. So there's so many ways of looking at it, and each use case is definitely unique. I just want to thank you for being here with us and sharing your experiences in the humorous way that you know how to do it. You had me really enthralled the whole time. I was like, oh man, what? Yeah, I can't believe that. That's so true. I've heard that you're able to put things in a way that, yes, I was nodding my head the whole last hour. So thank you, Elizabeth, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we will see you next week, same place, same time. Also, if you're not in the Slack, please get in that. I think Elizabeth is there, so you can continue talking to her there. Otherwise, another way to reach out to you, Elizabeth, if somebody wants to keep the conversation going.
If anyone wants to email me, my email is elizchabot@gmail.com. I'm going to put it in the channel. But also feel free to LinkedIn me. I am not on LinkedIn as avidly as I was before this, just because there are still a lot of people messaging me on LinkedIn about, I used to do a lot of clinical research and went public, and they launched a document where my name's still on there as a research manager. So it's sent out to, I think, over 3,000 people. So if you are on obstetrics and geriatric study, you're calling me right now. It's not fun. But I am responding to email.
Awesome. That's so cool. Well, thank you again, and we will see you all later. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye, guys.